Species. Unite.
Just makes everything worthwhile with what we did. It just highlights how flexible elephants are and how adaptable they are from captivity to wild, and that when given the chance, they will choose freedom and they choose autonomy.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. For close to 30 years, Brett Mitchell has lived alongside elephants. First in captivity, then eventually in the wild. His story begins in the mid-90s when he managed elephant-backed safaris in Zimbabwe and South Africa. But as the captive industry grew more commercialized and more cruel, Brett found himself on the front lines, witnessing wild elephants being taken from their herds and funneled into tourism and entertainment. It was a tipping point. Instead of accepting that reality, Brett made a decision that no one in South Africa had ever attempted at scale. He would return a full group of long captive elephants back to the wild. And what followed was a decade-long experiment in patience, trust, and a kind of hope that borders on radical. Brett developed a gentle, step-by-step, soft-release process, walking with the elephants each day, letting them choose their water holes and teaching them how to be wild again, and slowly removing himself from their world until one morning they simply walked away. Hi, Brett. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too, Beth. Nice to be here.
I want to start with talking about your history with elephants and how you got involved with them in the first place.
It's been 30 years now, been involved with elephants. It started back in 1995. I was part of a company that had started elephant-backed safaris as the manager of the operation for elephants, and conducted elephant-backed safari up until 2014. In 2001, 2002, we moved the elephants from Zimbabwe up to South Africa and opened up an operation in Pilanesberg, and got very involved in the captive industry in South Africa, which over the period from 2003 to 2004 in South Africa got pretty morbid in that there was a lot of wild captures happening with elephants for commercial gain. That sort of led me down a road of actually wanting to see these elephants, the elephants that I was with, return to the wild where they belong. And that started the process of where I am today. We started rewilding them in 2015 after we managed to get the company to close the operation. 10 years on, we've just taken the collars off after ending the last bit of research on them. And yeah, they've been wild for 10 years. So that's my journey in a nutshell, basically. Hopefully many more elephants to come.
So go back for a second. With the captive trade in South Africa, especially the wild elephants being captured for the captive trade, what does that mean? Like, what are they used for?
In South Africa and in Zimbabwe at the time, if we go back into the 70s and 80s, the national parks of both countries at that point in time were using culling as a way of population control for elephants. And during those culling processes, they decided that they wouldn't shoot a certain size of animal. And that was generally between the 2 to a 4-year-old calves that weren't shot. All of them were brought into a captive environment, and majority were sold overseas to zoos and circus. The majority of the elephants in the US, the African elephants, that is, came from the culls in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. And in Zimbabwe and also in South Africa, some of the elephants were kept locally by various individuals, and a tourism front basically came out of them where they started to utilize them in elephant-backed safaris, doing rides, and then the interaction side where people could come and feed them. And that was mainly started in Zimbabwe and then started in South Africa from the early 2000s. We were part of that in terms of the operation that I was working for. And then people saw what at the time was a rather large financial benefit. And there was a few individuals that really went about it badly, and they went and they actually caught wild elephants. They would go in and remove certain ages of elephants from the wild, from their herds, under the guise of population control on these reserves, under the guise that they were going to be poached or they were going to be shot, and they were put into captivity for commercial gain. And that really changed the industry in terms of it exploded into what was literally 2 or 3 operations in South Africa to over 20 in a sort of a 5 to 8 year period. So yeah, it was all for commercial gain.
The captive elephants that you worked with, when they were captive, were they like a herd of elephants?
They weren't a herd that you would constitute as a herd if you looked at it from a wild perspective and you looked at it as a matriarchal society with adult females, juveniles, sub-adults, etc. But it's a group of elephants that grew up together, some possibly related, some maybe not related. It depended on where they came from.
When you were still working with them in captivity, doing elephant-back safaris, obviously you got to know them really well. This is why you wanted to see them free. Will you talk about that a little bit, like who they were and why this was so important? Because at this point in the world, nobody had ever freed a captive group of elephants and rewilded them, correct?
Not quite correct. None of it was done on this level in terms of the process and the disengagement process of which I developed for rewilding. There'd been a few rewildings that had happened. There was a couple of elephants in Pilanesberg National Park that were originally captive. They actually came out of the States back to Africa, but they were few and far between. And it was now, nobody had done the number of elephants at one time. My first group was these elephants I'd been with since 1995, 96, I'd been with them. And that was 20 years. So, and it was 7 elephants together. So nobody had done a group of 7 animals. It was developing a system where you could rewire them through a gradual process, because one of the biggest problems with a lot of rewilding programs is that if you don't disengage slowly enough, it's what we call a hard release. And that hard release creates a massive amount of trauma and stress on the individuals as they go out there. They may adapt and it might end up being successful. However, you want to minimize the trauma to as little as possible and be at a gradual transition into the wild. And that's what I developed effectively.
And what was their life, these 7 elephants, what was their life like in captivity, like before this process started?
We did everything as positively as possible. One of the realities, unfortunately, with handling elephants in a free contact or direct contact management system is that there is a certain amount of dominance that comes with it. But everything we did was through positive reinforcement, and their life was as close as we could get it at that particular time to being natural, in that they fed out on the reserve every day. Whilst they did the elephant-back safaris, between the rides, we did a morning ride and an afternoon ride, between that they were out in the natural environment, in some cases interacting with wild elephant. So they had very much a natural life. It doesn't take away from captivity in that they were put into a stable every night, they were ridden every day. So that side of it doesn't change. But I do believe that in terms of how they were managed and looked after was as ethical as we could make it, put it that way.
So talk about the process. What was going through your head? What were people saying to you? And how'd you do it?
I'd spent a long time figuring it out in my head. And whilst we were in the process of getting the permits to move them to the property that I wanted to rewild them on, that took close on a year to finally get all the permits. During that time, I started to do various tests, if you want to call them that, just little trial runs on the property that we were operating on. It wasn't a very big reserve. It was only 500 hectares, pretty small. So we started to do little things, leaving the elephants out at night, coming and finding them in the morning and seeing what they do. We had left food in their stables. And what was interesting through that whole thing was, even in that small system, when they literally, when I say they were close, they could, if they wanted to, they were within a 10-minute walk of their stables at night where we used to leave them. And during the 3 months I was doing this test before we actually moved, they never came back to the stables, which in itself highlighted what they were choosing. And as they slowly started gaining their autonomy. And then when we moved to the reserve, then of course the translocation happened, which is always unfortunately traumatic, no matter which way you put it. Moving elephants there's a sense of, there's a certain amount of stress that goes with it. But at the new property, which was a very large reserve, it was 90,000 hectares. It was the second largest reserve in South Africa. These elephants were to be the founding population on that reserve. There weren't any elephants on that reserve at the time. We had built a boma, which is a large fenced area of about 2 hectares that the elephants would be in at night. And then during the day, we would go out with the elephants, walk them to water points, basically learn the reserve with them. They would learn the reserve with us. And that's how it all sort of started. So we would walk to water holes. I'd put the boma in a position that I could access at that point in time was 4 water points within a walking distance in the morning. So the furthest was about 10 to 12 kilometers away from the boma, and the closest was about 7 kilometers. So we were moving to the water every day. And what was interesting through that whole process was the elephants decided that only 2 of the water holes that they actually liked. And so we gave up walking to the others, and we ended up walking to the 2. One, of course, had to be the furthest one away. We did that every day. But during this whole process, and that was, we took about 3 months, 3.5 months before we came to the release, to the release point where they would go out on their own. But during that process, we had disengaged further and further from the elephants every day. It was a gut feeling thing in terms of they're ready to go out on their own, and chatting with my guys who were amazing through the whole process. It was the 10th of December, 2015. And we said, well, that's the day. Tomorrow morning we'll do it. And we came and we opened the boma, and we drove up. It was at sunrise, opened the boma, and we didn't do anything. It was their choice where they wanted to go. And that was it. We weren't going to interfere again unless it was extremely necessary. And the elephants walked out. They disappeared into a block somewhere where there was no road. And that was it. Of course, we could monitor them on GPS collars, which we did. And we didn't see them the whole day. And it was probably about 10 minutes before absolute last light, they ended up popping out at the one water hole, which was amazing to see. And then they went on a walkabout. And the first week that they were out on their own, they probably on a daily basis covered anywhere between 20 and 40 kilometers a day. And that was them just exploring the reserve. And then they started to settle, and that was it. And that's how it went from there. And then we monitored them there on out, just purely from vehicle, and making sure that all their behaviors were within the normal parameters of a wild elephant, that they weren't approaching vehicles incorrectly, just making sure that they were acting as any wild elephant would do. And yeah, that was pretty much about it, I'd say.
Was that one of the concerns, that maybe once they were on their own, that they would go up to vehicles, or like what were the concerns about what would happen to them if something bad were to happen? What would that be?
The proponents that don't believe elephants can be rewilded always say that you're going to have these animals walking into lodges, coming up to cars and putting their trunks into cars to try and find something. And yes, if you don't rewild correctly and you don't transition correctly and you don't redirect behaviors correctly, sure, you will get that. That's just effectively managing a rewilding system incorrectly. So that was a very important thing in a very important component to the whole rewilding, was making sure that that was right. And we spent a lot of time prior to the translocation doing a lot of practices with the elephants where we could still get out, we were still managing them, we were still handling them. So you could get out and block them, you could get out and do various things if they weren't responding to a tap on a vehicle or a clap of the hand. So you were also, what you wanted to create is an environment where whatever we were doing, any normal guide or person on a reserve would react to an elephant. So one of the ways in terms of stopping an elephant approaching a vehicle would be, say, tapping on the side of your door, making a slight noise. They stop, they're aware of something, they carry on around you and they carry on with their business. So it was about creating an environment for those animals, or a line in the sand that they weren't allowed to cross. They could come up close, but they weren't allowed to touch, etc. And that's what we did. We did that day in, day out. And that over time became the norm. So there was no reason, and there's also no reason for them to approach a vehicle because there wasn't any food source. There's no reason to approach the lodges because there's no food source, and there was a invisible barrier, if you want to call it that, where if they came over a certain point, you would block them, and then they realize, okay, we're not allowed to do that, and they give it up. And then over time, they just go about their lives. I mean, now we're just taking the collars off, and finally, it was one of the things that we always wanted to do was, once the GPS collars came off, they truly were back wild, and that we wouldn't know where they are. Not that they weren't already wild, but leading up to the removal of the collars, I was sitting with one of the bulls, and I mean, I've known him since 1995, and you wouldn't have known the difference between him and a wild elephant. And he was just still chilling under the shade of a tree about 30 meters away. And I spent probably nearly 2 hours with him. And he never once even thought about coming over to the vehicle. And that just highlights, if you do it properly, you will get a very good result if you rewild properly.
That's incredible. So why 10 years until you took the collars off?
It just happened to be 10 years. Yeah, no real reason, Beth. It was purely it ended up being 10 years. The collars were soon to be needed to be replaced at any case. So it was about taking them off, and we chose not to replace the collars. They'd been replaced once. It was very important that we got as much data from this as possible, that we were able to produce peer-reviewed publications that show that rewilding does work, and it is very possible. So it becomes a very viable, humane option for captive elephants. I think probably the best option for captive elephants. And so it was important to get that data, and it was a simple case of, well, we either replacing the collars and we carrying on for another possibly 4 or 5 years. However, a decision had to be made on, we don't want to do research for the sake of research. We had all the data that we needed. We've already produced 2 papers, and then we've got another 2 that are in process at the moment. And there was not much more we could do with those particular elephants in terms of what we were needing. Of course, we're going to keep in touch with them. I mean, that's very important. It might just take a little bit longer to find them, considering that we used to struggle to find them even when they had collars because of the size of the property. So now it might be a very long holiday trying to find the elephants.
When did you bring in more elephants? When did it grow?
So the original plan was always to bring in more elephants to create the right social structures. We wanted to get the rewilding done first and make sure that that was successful. And once that was successful, we then started working the plan to make sure that the social structure was completely balanced for the females and also for the bulls. That was very, very important. The initial herd we moved was a female herd, a natal group of 6 wild elephants, to improve the female social structure, or the family social structure, if you want to call it that, on the reserve. We didn't know how that would pan out, whether they would actually engage with each other, whether they would join. We weren't sure what would happen there. And I mean, what was amazing, I'll tell you a little story, and that was when we arrived with the elephants at the reserve, the wild elephants, it was about 2:00 in the morning, and Chiquenya, the female, which is the matriarch of the rewarded group, she's an amazing matriarch. She was probably around 5 kilometers away at the time. And these elephants in the truck started rumbling, and there was a lot of communication going on. We weren't sure who they were doing it with, if it was just to them. And we came off the truck, and normally when they come off the truck, the elephants will come off and just disappear. They want to get as far away from the truck as possible. These guys, they didn't move far. They moved a couple of 100 meters away, and there was a lot of rumbling and noise. And of course, it was dark. You couldn't see anything. And then when we got back to the lodge and we were watching the collars of both herds, the new herd, Chiquenya had actually come up from 5Ks, came up and caught up to these elephants. They were only a kilometer away from the truck when she caught up to them, and literally walked them straight to water. It was unbelievable. And they went straight to water. They drank within an hour of coming off the truck. Sometimes it takes 24 hours for them to find water. And then they went on a walkabout the wild herd to find out where they were. And now today they move together as two herds, but they move together as one, which is amazing. So that was the female side. So I digressed there. That was the female side. And then in 2022, we moved 3 bulls, one very large 47-year-old bull, a really big bull, to really bring in the right social structures for the other bulls. The rewilded bulls were already big boys. They were 38 years old, so they were really big. So we needed a really big bull to make sure that the balance was right. And then we brought in a 25-year-old to get the balance below that, and then a young 15-year-old to get the structure of the bulls correct all the way through. And that's been a great success. That's really shifted how they are moving around the reserve, how they are engaging with the females. It's been a really, really positive. So now the structures are completely, the structure's complete now.
The 3 bulls you brought in, were they wild?
Yes, wild bulls.
Did they become part of the herd with the original, like with the rewilded herd, or the other one?
Of the 3 bulls there, like I said, there was the 47-year-old and the 15-year-old who came from the same reserve to come up Kalahari Reserve where my elephants are. And he went north. He actually ended up going north, and he was just up in the north around there. The 15-year-old joined up with the rewilded herd and has stayed with them. And then when we brought in the 25-year-old, which was from another reserve, and that was 2 months later, he actually went north as well. And he joined up with the other bull, and they became buddy, and they stayed up in the north of the reserve for a year before they even thought about coming down. It was so interesting. What it highlighted was how they also take time to settle in. As a wild elephant that gets translocated, they also have to go through a process of settling in. And then after a year, they started coming down, and then there was interactions between them and the other bulls and then the females. But because the bull structure is correct, your bulls don't always stay with the herd. So they'll come in when they're in their must cycle and come into the herd. And that's what we've been seeing as their cycles come in, they displace each other and join the herd and displace another one. And then he comes into must and displaces the other one. So everybody is getting on with each other, for a better word.
Have there been any babies?
Yes, they have. So beautifully in February 2019, we originally thought they were twins because there was 2 new babies, brand spanking new babies that were seen. It was literally a week, 4 or 5 days, 7 days apart. And everybody was thinking, are they twins? And then we figured it out that it was actually mom and daughter had given birth literally within days of each other, which was it was unbelievable. And the beautiful thing about that was they were both wild conceived and wild-born calves, which just is a testament to the success of the rewilding, and that rewilded elephants can contribute to the conservation of their species as well. And so those two calves were born in 2019, and then Chiquenya's second daughter, Wedi, who was 3 years younger than Tilimalo, she had her first calf in 2021. We haven't had any further calves yet. We did place the females onto emu contraception as a proactive management option. We're not saying they mustn't be breeding. We're just slowing the breeding rate down so that you don't reach a critical mass where you have to now translocate, etc. So you want to get on top of that straight away. Hopefully you're expecting a calf sometime, I'm hoping in the next year or two, from one of the girls again, which will be amazing.
It must have been so amazing to see the first two wild calves born from captive elephants who've been rewilded. Like just all the meaning in that.
Huge meaning. Just makes everything worthwhile with what we did. It just highlights how flexible elephants are and how adaptable they are from captivity to wild, and that when given the chance, they will choose freedom and they choose autonomy.
And how often do you see them?
Not often enough. I'd love to see them regularly because they were part of our as study animals, if you want to call them that, from a research perspective. We were up on the reserve once or twice a year collecting data. We were with them now in this year, May, June, when we took the collars off and collected our last data, and then 2024. So we've been with them basically for the last 6-7 years, twice a year. But the reserve is there. Hannah Killian, who is one of our trustees, he's actually the ecologist on the reserve where the elephants are. So there's always somebody there, that will see them. But they're wild elephants and they must go about their life. And when we don't see them, it means that they're doing what they should be doing.
And what was reaction like? Because so many people say you can't do this. You can't rewild a big group of elephants like you did. How did people react that didn't think this was a possibility?
We've been very quiet. We just got on and did what we needed to do. That was doing the right thing. What was very important, like I said just now, was getting the data and putting together the publications to show that it is possible, so that the proponents that claim that it can't be done, the science is there to show that it can be done. So I think some of them, may have shifted mindsets now, but it's hard to say exactly.
So has anyone followed suit? Is anyone else doing this now?
In South Africa, there's been, the figure, it's around about 25 animals, I think, that have been rewilded so far. Some of them were done prior to mine, but on a hard release. So they were literally just they were let out on their own devices. There was no monitoring. There was none of that. So we don't know the whole process of that. But now they are going about their lives as rewilded animals. Up in Kenya, with all the orphans, there's been a lot of releases. I think the rewilding part, elephants that keep returning to their place of where they were released from are not rewilded. I think they need to go about and carry on with their life as an elephant and not worry about the human side of things.
Earlier, you were talking about in the 70s and 80s, we had all these big culls in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And now it's starting to happen again with the culling. Will you just talk about that a little bit and what's happening and why this is happening?
So if we go back to the 70s and 80s, when they were culling elephants in Zimbabwe and South Africa on a regular basis, that was determined at the time by what they classed as carrying capacity, and they could only have X amount of elephants in these national parks, and they needed to maintain their numbers. 40, 50 years later, science, I think, has shown a lot, and that habitats, ecological systems will ebb and flow. There is a challenge, without a doubt, with human and wildlife and space, and that's becoming a huge problem. There's unfortunately a cull that took place in Zimbabwe recently at a place called Sabi Valley Conservancy. I think that there's been a lot of options on the table to reduce the speed at which populations grew. So immunocontraception is one. It's a proactive method which, if done at the start of a system, you will slow your growth rate right down to a point where you maintain the same population all the way through. Once you get to the natural die-off from the older animals, just naturally dying of old age, then you're going to rotate through your system. So there's huge debate around the whole culling at the moment, and whether there are too many elephants or whether there are not too many elephants. And there's a lot of the science is saying we've got the space for a lot more animals, a lot more elephant. I think what we also have is a lot of individuals who may not want to change their thought process based on how they've always done things. And that in itself is always a challenge. So there's no golden wand that anybody can wave right now in terms of fixing this problem. I think what's very important that everybody needs to start working together for one goal, of how do we do this in the best way possible. And yeah, it's a tough answer. It's a tough question. And nobody knows the answer. There's just been a series of webinars now over the last 5 weeks discussing a lot of that, and there's no consensus between parties yet.
And is there just a lot of resistance to contraceptives?
Not necessarily. I think initially there may have been, if you go back 20 years, 25 years when we first started, in South Africa there's like 45 or 50 reserves that are already using contraceptive. But it has to be a proactive management tool. So it doesn't help when you reach your capacity and now you want to contracept. You should have been contracepting 10 years ago. So there's a lot of reserves that need to take accountability of, hey, we should have done this earlier. However, there's a lot of reserves on the contraception. There's a debate around if it's viable in the big populations. And when you speak to Dr. Audrey Delsink, who basically pioneered the whole contraceptive thing, and like she says, that's just ramping up the volume. It's very doable, and it's something which if there's an option in which we can actually take, I think we should be taking it.
What's next with elephants, for you?
When we founded the Elephant Reintegration Trust, the main objective is to actually develop a reserve where we are able to rewild, hopefully, the remaining captive elephants in South Africa, of which we have 89, 90 of them, which still remain in captivity. We have been working hard towards that. Naturally, that's a very large funding component, which is required. It's about doing it, having the land area, the right size in which we can actually start and actually do full rewilding all the way through to at least a minimum of 30, 40 elephants in that system. And that's probably why it's taking that much longer. We have land identified. We've got a great proposal out on that. We've actually partnered with Bring the Elephant Home on that as well. And that is the next main objective, is to develop this property and then hopefully start getting some of these other elephants that are stuck in captive environments rewilded. That would be the main aim. And then as we go along, there's also just simply doing research and improving elephants on fence systems in South Africa in terms of how they're managed, so that we are, science is talking to management, where we are doing the right interventions so that we're not creating problems. We are improving the situation as opposed to making problems. And so all the research that we do must tie into how one manages elephants and how we can improve the welfare parameters of elephants and fence reserves throughout South Africa.
Are people ready to let go of their captive elephants if you had this land?
It's an interesting question. I think a few of them are. I know definitely one place is people we've been talking to, and I would suggest that if there's somewhere available and the right discussions take place, definitely a few of these facilities would more than likely give up. It's getting to the point, I believe, that it's becoming problematic for a lot of the facilities. They're running into challenges with elephants. The tourism is not there like it used to be. COVID has hurt a lot of people, but just the education around and the individual travelers' knowledge of what is good and what is bad to do has improved over the last probably 4 or 5 years, which is really good. So I think there's a combination of stuff. So certain facilities are still ticking along happily. Others, I think, are struggling. So one would have to just find the ones that wanting to do it, and hopefully, it's about doing the right thing, because the industry is on its way out. There haven't been any captive born calves in South Africa for probably 7 years.
That's awesome.
When I did
That's
a
amazing.
census in 2019, there were only 4 elephants below the age of 8 years. And of that, one was an orphan. So the industry itself, I think, is on its way out.
That's really good news.
Yes. Well, it's the only way to stop the captive industry is by stopping the breeding.
Well, I really hope that you end up with every single one of those captive elephants at some point in the future.
Yeah, it would be amazing.
Yeah. Congratulations on everything else up to now. It's an awesome story. And thank you, Brett, so much.
No, thank you, Beth, for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
To learn more about Brett and the Elephant Reintegration Trust, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polky-Link, Hannah Gabrielson, Bethany Jones, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.